All right, we're live. Hey, Brian, thanks for participating in this conversation regarding the considerations of using your retirement money for business financing. I thought we'd spend a few minutes just to go through some of the top eligibility for considerations for somebody who's exploring this as a potential financing option for their business.
Thanks so much, George, for allowing us to have this conversation, and look forward just to being a resource for people who are considering how to go down this path. We're Rios Business Advisors. We are an advisory firm that's helped companies be able to structure their business for growth and strategies to help them be able to scale operations. And so, gotten a lot of questions that we've heard from clients who ask, how can we be able to utilize 401ks and to do the rollover business startups to be able to help them using those funds to be able to start a new business on concept. And so there are a couple questions that I know that we've had in cost of supply. And so we'll ask some of those questions here today so that we can hopefully answer some of people's burning desires and questions. The first one would be, for instance, what are the eligible funds that can we use? Can we use 401ks? Can we use IRAs? What is eligible and what is not eligible?
Great questions. Yes. Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate the chance to discuss this with you and your clients. Just for a little bit of background, I'm with My Solo 401k Financial. We help individuals use their retirement funds for business financing, and it's certainly possible to do this. There's an IRS approved way where the individual can access money in their retirement account to fund their own business. Could be a startup business, could be buying a business, and they're able to use their funds without having to pay taxes or penalties, which of course can be a great funding option for certain individuals. But it's always important to understand what the considerations are, what some of the key requirements are going to be going forward, the cost, the timeline, et cetera. So yeah, the starting point a lot of times is going to be, okay, do I have eligible funds? Because in order to do this, the individual is going to have to transfer money from their existing retirement account over to a new retirement account, specifically a 401k, and then the funds are going to be invested in their business. And so if they can't even roll over money, if they don't have eligible funds, in other words, then really they can't even get out of the starting blocks. So eligible funds is always a great starting point. So to be specific about your question, one would have eligible funds if they either have money that's in a former employer plan, like say they had an old job, a 401k through an old job, or money that's in a non-Roth IRA. So in other words, you can have traditional IRA funds that can be rolled over, but you can't have money in a Roth IRA. Now, if you have Roth money in an old 401k or a former employer plan, it's not limited to old 401ks. It could be a TSP, it could be a 403b, but typically you have to have money in a former employer plan to be able to roll it over. Now, I say typically, there are some exceptions. For example, if you're over age 59 and a half, then even if you're still working at a company, they're not going to be able to prevent you from rolling money out of that plan. Or if you maybe you're at a current company, but you had previously rolled over funds from a prior company to that plan. Well, typically the company won't prevent you from at least rolling the money that you rolled into that plan out of the plan. But if your money's in your current employer plan, before you can roll it out, a lot of times you're going to have to quit, or you're going to have to separate from service before you can roll it out. So that's always a good starting point. Just to really confirm it 100%, the individual would have to check with the administrator of that plan. And you could just ask a simple question. You could say, okay, can I roll my money to an IRA? Because if your money's in your current employer plan and you can roll it to an IRA without having to leave your job, because let's say you're over 59 and a half, or let's say you had rolled that money in from a prior employer, then if you can roll it to an IRA, then you can roll it to this ROBS 401k. It's going to be easier if you go and ask them, hey, can I roll it to an IRA? As opposed to trying to explain it to the administrator that you're setting up this ROBS 401k to fund your business, because that's probably just going to confuse the person that's answering that question. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I appreciate the clarity and answer. And so
Awesome.
in the process of rolling over these funds into a new 401k, it's going to be tied with the entity. So one of the questions that I've had is regarding a C corporation. From what you see on your website, it mentions that it would be transferred into a C corporation. Do they need to previously establish and have a new started C corporation before starting this process with My Solo 401k? Or in the process, will you be able to help them with the creation process of a new C corporation? And should it be
No,
separate from the operating entity?
yeah, great, fantastic questions. Yes. So, um, as I mentioned, it's possible to use retirement money to fund your business without having to pay taxes or penalties, but specific requirements have to be met. So, first of all, you have to you have to fund your business in a certain manner. So you have to invest it as an equity investment in your business. And your business has to be operated as a corporation, taxed as a C corporation. So technically what you're doing is you're transferring money that's eligible to be rolled over to your new employer plan. So your new employer needs to be the C corporation. So you are participating in the C corporation. C corporation has a 401k. So really it's just like you're rolling your money over to your new job, right? You could have a new job in corporate America. You want to, in order for you to be able to, roll it over to your new job's 401k, obviously you got to be working in that business. That's how you're eligible to be participating in the 401k. So here though, you're just happen to be rolling it over to this corporation that you are the president of, that you're the sole owner of. So you're exactly right. The money's going to go from the existing retirement account to a new 401k that's sponsored by your new business. And your new business needs to be operated as a corporation, taxed as a C corporation. Now, if you don't have an entity, that's fine. As part of our services, we help set up the corporation for your business. If you already have an entity, that's fine as long as it's a corporation taxed as a C corporation. Now, if it's not an entity if you have an entity, but it's not a corporation taxed as a C corporation, you're either going to need to convert that entity to a C corporation, and we can help you do that. Or sometimes individuals will contribute their entity to a C corporation, or sometimes sometimes our customers will just say, you know what, we'll just start fresh with a new C corporation, right? They may have gone out there, formed an LLC just in the rush of trying to start a business, and they just kind of picked a random name for that LLC and they haven't done anything with that LLC. They may say, you know what, let me just start fresh with a new C Corp. I can always repurpose that LLC for something else. Like maybe down the road, I'll own a real estate investment property and I'll hold it through that LLC, right? Whereas some individuals say, I really thought a lot about the name for that LLC, right? So I either want to convert that LLC to a C Corp, which if there's a process to do that in your state, which in most states there is, then we can help with that conversion process. Or they might say, you know what, I'm thinking about having multiple lines of business, maybe multiple locations of the same business, right? Or I'm thinking about holding real estate in a separate entity, right? So I'm still going to keep this LLC separate, but I'm going to put it underneath the C corporation. So now I'm going to have the new C corporation that's the parent of this LLC. And then I'll use this to say, operate one of the locations. And then in the future, when I'm ready to open up my second location, I'll set up a brother sister LLC underneath that same C corporation. So it's all under the C Corp umbrella. So bottom line is if you have an entity, we can work with you and we'll just work through that situation. If you don't have an entity, we can work with you and we can help set up a new C Corp. But the key takeaway in terms of for someone who's exploring this is that you have to recognize that you're going to have to operate your business as a C Corp, right? A lot of folks might be hearing from their, say, small business tax advisor who might be saying, hey, you should operate this as an S Corp, right? Because that's kind of like the thinking for a lot of these small business tax advisors, right? But in order for you to be able to use your retirement money where you don't have to pay taxes or penalties, operating your business as an S Corp is not an option. It has to be a C Corp. So it's going to be good to start to understand that, right? Understand that in terms of maybe going back to your tax advisor and saying, okay, I understand you're telling me, generally speaking, it's better to operate it as an S Corp, but I'm trying to use my retirement money. So I'm going to have to operate this business as a C Corp. So tell me, tax advisor, if I operate my business as a C Corp, what are the tax implications, right? Is that going to be a wash from a tax perspective? Or am I going to be paying a lot more in taxes? Or maybe I'm even paying less in taxes. Who knows, right? But at least I can start to analyze how this business is going to be taxed as a C Corp.
Makes sense.
So, So then I kind of jump to that third point here on our list, which is working into business, right? So again, it goes back to the basics. We want to use the retirement money without having to pay taxes or penalties. We've got to satisfy the requirements of the ROBS 401k structure. And so the whole foundation here is that I'm rolling money from an existing retirement account to another retirement account, which means that transfer is not going to be taxable. And then I'm investing it inside when it's still in the new retirement account, specifically the 401k. I'm not taking it out and investing it into my business. I'm investing it directly in my business. So it's not a distribution, right? I'm not actually taking money out of my 401k, so it's not taxable. So that's why it has to be structured as a stock purchase in the C corp, because that's what the rules require. So now it's an investment. It's still inside your 401k, so it's not subject to taxes or penalties because it's technically not a distribution. So in order for me to be able to transfer money to this new 401k, I've got to be eligible to participate in that 401k. In order for me to be eligible to participate in the 401k, I need to be working for the new C corp, right? Because it's a 401k sponsored by this new C corp. This 401k is made available to the employees of the C corp. Now, on day one, like in most cases, the only employee of the C corp is me, and that's okay. That's fine. But it still goes back to that point that this ROBS 401k business financing structure is for people who are using it to fund a business that they're going to be working in, because I need to be a bona fide employee of that C corp. Now, I don't necessarily need to take a salary. And from a ROBS 401k perspective, I can't take a salary until the company is generating income to justify my salary. But just because I'm not taking a salary doesn't mean I'm not working in the business, right? There's plenty of business owners who work night and day and don't take a salary. It doesn't mean they're not an employee, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the key again is you got to be a bona fide employee working in the business. That's the foundation that allows me to participate in the 401k. That'll then allows me to roll over my money. And then the 401k plan itself allows for investing in company stock. And that's how I fund my business. So that's point 3. Point 4 and 5 go together, right? So there's different scenarios that we're presented with. Sometimes individuals want to use it to start a new business, right? Whereas other individuals want to use it to buy a business. And then there's even a third category where people are trying to use it to fund their existing business, right? So the specific steps that will apply and considerations are going to vary. Okay, which track am I on, right? So if you're funding a new startup business, it's pretty straightforward, right? You just set up a new C corporation. C corporation sponsors a 401k. I've got money that's eligible to be rolled over. I'm going to be working in the business. I roll over the money to the 401k. Step 1, that's not a taxable event. I then invest it into the stock of the C corp, right? Now the corporation is funded with the retirement money that was invested. Now the C corporation can use it to fund the launch of that business, in simple terms. Second track, buying a business, very similar, right? Say a new C corp sponsors a 401k, rolled over eligible money, invested in the C corp. Now the C corp can use that money to buy another business, right? And that's fine as long as we're using it to buy a business from an unrelated person, right? I can't use this to buy a business from myself or buy a business from my spouse or buy a business from my parent, right? So you can't use it to buy a business from what they call a disqualified person. Another consideration would be, okay, am I using it to buy a business as an asset purchase or a stock purchase? So 95% of the time, our customers are using the money to buy a business as an asset purchase. And that's because typically they would want to buy a business as an asset purchase regardless, because even if they weren't using retirement money, in other words, because in simple terms, they don't want to buy a lawsuit, right? They don't want to buy all the baggage that might go along with that entity. They're not trying to buy the entity that the person from whom they're buying the business is currently operating the business. They're trying to buy the underlying assets, right? The name, the customer list, right? Maybe the equipment, et cetera, the website. So in that case, that's the cleanest from a 401k business financing perspective. If that C corporation, that new C corporation that's funded with your retirement money is going to buy the assets of another business from an unrelated person, and now that C corporation is going to operate the business going forward. It is possible to also use the ROBS 401k business financing to buy a business as a stock purchase, in which case that C corporation is actually going to buy another entity that operates the business. The considerations there would be that that other entity, that third party entity, cannot be taxed as an S corporation going forward, because an S corporation cannot be owned by a C corporation. That's one consideration. Another consideration is that if that third party entity, that target business entity itself has a retirement plan, like a 401k, that's going to make it essentially a deal killer, because it would just make it very complex, because now those two 401k plans would have to be merged. So we've never really seen it done because of all the complexities that go along with it. Most folks just say it's not worth it. I'll just fund the business in some other fashion. But it's actually very rare that it even comes up, because like I said, most folks want to buy a business as an asset purchase. In the rare event that they want to buy it as a stock purchase, usually that third party entity doesn't have its own 401k plan. But let me just flag that as a potential. Then the third scenario, right? First was fund a new business. Second was buy an existing business. Third scenario was, okay, let me use this money to fund my existing business, right? And that also can be done, but we're still going to have to fit within those ROBS 401k requirements. So that means that now going forward, I'm going to have to operate my business as a corporation, taxed as a C corporation. So that's going to require me to do, if I don't already have a C corporation through which I operate my business, I'm going to have to somehow move my business into a C corporation. So that could entail converting my entity to a C corporation, or contributing my entity to a C corporation, right? It also it's going to require me to get a valuation of my business. And that goes back to how the business is funded, right? Because the way that you use your retirement money to fund your business via a ROBS transaction is that you're rolling your money over to a 401k, and then you're buying stock in your new business, right? Now, if you're funding a brand new business, it's going to be very straightforward. The number of shares is going to correspond to the ratio of retirement money and non-retirement money invested, right? If I invest 10,000 for my savings and 90,000 for my retirement account, I'm going to own 90,000 shares through my 401k and 10,000 shares personally. But let's say that I'm using it to fund an existing business. And let's say my business is worth $100,000. And now I want to roll over and invest $200,000. Well, at the end of the day, I'm going to own 1/3 of my company personally, and the other 2/3 is going to be owned by the 401k, because the total new value of my company is 300,000. It's almost like I'm bringing on another investor that's investing 200,000, right? They're going to want equity in the business that corresponds to not only the amount of money they invested, but the pre-investment value of that business. So here it works kind of the same way. If I'm trying to use the money to fund my existing business, to determine how many shares are going to be issued to the 401k, we need to know, okay, well, what's that pre-ROBS value of the business? In this case, 100,000. And how much money am I looking to invest via my 401k? And based on those two numbers, we'll know, okay, well, how much is going to be owned by the 401k and how much is going to be owned personally. Does that make sense, Brian?
Makes a lot of sense. And thank you for that clarity. And so, in other considerations too, as we talked about new businesses and buying businesses, another question individuals will have is, what happens if they want to take in additional owners, right? So what if they wanted to team up with where they have a business that has 2 or 3 people? How would they handle that? And then also the considerations for being able to tap into their 401k.
Awesome. Yes. So it certainly can be done, although it's not as common, to be frank, just with the scenarios that we're seeing. Certainly if it's a husband and wife scenario or other close family member, that's more common. Sometimes it might be 1 or 2 other business partners. So at the end of the day, you go back to those foundational requirements. So those requirements being that the investment of retirement money needs to be structured as a stock purchase, and all the other stockholders of the company need to invest cash in proportion to their ownership percentages. So if the other owners want to use retirement money, they have to be analyzed just like this individual, right? Do they have eligible funds? Are they going to be working in the business, et cetera? If the other owners are just looking to invest non-retirement funds, that's fine also, but just recognize that their ownership is going to be proportional to the amount of money invested. So scenarios that wouldn't work, for example, let's say somebody's trying to do a food truck business, right? And they have the cash, and then they have a business partner who's the chef, right? Well, if they were not using their 401k business financing plan to fund the business, then they're free to negotiate whatever type of terms they want. They might say, if you're the one with the cash and I'm the chef, right? You might say, okay, George, I'm going to put up 100,000 and you're going to work 80 hours a week until we get this thing off the ground, right? So we're going to split it 50-50. So I'm bringing my sweat equity, my expertise, et cetera. And obviously we're free to negotiate what we want. But if you're using the 401k business financing plan, I'm not going to get any stock if I'm not bringing any cash to the table, right? You can compensate me as an employee. You can give me a bonus if I do really well, so I can still get some of the upside, just like any employee, right? But that's all going to be W-2 wages to me. I'm not going to end up with any equity in the company. So the consideration when it comes to bringing on other owners is just understand that if they're going to use retirement money, they got to meet the same requirements that this individual who's considering using the ROBS 401k business financing plan would have to meet. They got to have eligible funds. They got to work in the business. If the other owner is going to be investing non-retirement money, then their ownership is going to need to be in proportion to the cash invested. For some folks, that's totally what they were planning on doing anyways. But for other folks, that might not align to their original business plan. So now the question becomes, okay, do they still want to proceed, or do they want to go back and renegotiate with this other person, et cetera? And then just a couple quick hitters, timeline. I mean, generally speaking, it's about 3 weeks on the calendar. Your biggest X factor, though, is going to be where's the money coming from, right? And we design our process to be as fast as possible. In other words, we'll start forming the corporation, et cetera, at the same time the funds are being transferred over. But that's your pace setter, is like, how long does it take for these funds to be transferred over? If somebody just left their job, a lot of times it might take a month before HR has updated the records so they can initiate the rollover, et cetera. But if it's been a while and they're listed as a former employer plan, typically it's going to be right within that 3-week time frame. Funds transfer by check, right? So that, which ultimately helps protect the individual, because that shows that it wasn't a taxable distribution, because the check will be made payable to the new 401k. But that does add time, right? Because the check's got to be cut, check to come in the mail, check to clear into the new 401k account. Cost, we charge $3,000. That includes everything that's needed, right? So that's going to include setting up the corp, the plan, the rollover, the first 12 months of ongoing compliance support. And then on the anniversary date, so say 12 months later. So if you sign up in January 2025, January 2026, our annual fee of $899 will be due, and that'll cover the second year. And the reason you need an annual fee is because we provide the ongoing compliance support for the 401k. So maintaining this 401k is not just a one-time event, right? Or setting it up is not just a one-time event. It needs to be maintained, right? There's annual filing. There's an annual filing requirement. In order to prepare that annual filing, a third-party valuation is needed. We facilitate that valuation, and the cost of that third-party valuation is included as part of the annual fee, et cetera.
Awesome. I mean, you've covered all the questions that I could think of that our audience generally has. So, George, I appreciate you going into depth with the answers and helping providing insights for individuals who are interested in using their 401k. I hope this discussion has been very fruitful for individuals. And if you have any further questions, feel free to contact Rios Business Advisors, and also check with My Solo 401k for all of your servicing needs. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you so much. Thank you.